Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the University of Aberdeen Energy Transition webinar and Q&A. My name is Professor John Underhill. I am the University Director for Energy Transition and also the academic lead for the UK's Centre for Doctoral Training called GeoNet Zero. That is the role of geoscience, the role that geoscience plays in the energy transition and the challenge to get to net zero emissions targets. I'm also a member of the UK Energy Minister's Subsurface Task Force that looks to have an oversight of the subsurface onshore and offshore and how the role that it will play within the energy transition. I'm an active researcher, have a postgraduate community of postdocs and PhDs associated with the research area. And we have 3 or 4 major themes that we are tackling. First, looking to find solutions for the energy trilemma. You'll hear a lot about the trilemma over the course of the next hour, but it's effectively balancing energy security, affordability and cost of living, and thirdly, environmental sustainability and climate compatibility, getting the balance between those particular elements. I also look at the geological and geophysical characterization of the subsurface, whereby we look to seek to get the best use, the optimal use of the subsurface within the energy transition. So that means looking at applications like geothermal, carbon storage, hydrogen storage, and other techniques that could contribute to the transition itself. It means that spatial planning is important, both onshore and offshore. It's mighty crowded in some of the marine waters around the United Kingdom, which include things like wind farms, the seabeds being used for wind farms, but also fisheries and other stakeholders, including environmental protection, marine protection areas. And the aim is to try and have technically informed decision making at the forefront of policy decisions being made. In terms of the energy transition, that represents one of the major global challenges of our time. And at Aberdeen University, this has been recognised by setting up an interdisciplinary centre that draws upon the strengths of all the schools, be it geosciences, be it engineering, be it in law, social science and the like. This allows a collective effort to be made to tackle this major challenge. And of course, energy allows for industrial growth, entrepreneurial activity, and other public goods to be offered with health, nutrition, heating, lighting, transportation, education, and so on, all being part and parcel of the derivatives of that energy source. However, oil, gas, and indeed coal globally currently provide for 80% of the total global energy needs. And in terms of the UK, oil and gas count for 3/4 of the UK's supplies. Given the high carbon footprint that results from the current dependency on fossil fuels, there is an urgent need for us to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions their use leads to, and we seek to decarbonise industry and seek to find solutions with renewable green energy techniques and methodologies that would enable us to transition rather than have a cliff edge, a transition towards a greener, cleaner, low carbon future. So the research and training we do at Aberdeen University addresses these key challenges that face the energy transition and seek to reduce emissions, enable global, national and regional net zero targets to be met. And the Interdisciplinary Centre combines critical research with industry leading training in the form of our PhD and MSc programs to address all aspects of the energy trilemma, as I said, energy security, affordability, and environmental sustainability and climate compatibility. Without further ado, that's enough for me by way of introduction. What I'd like to do is to introduce the panelists, and I'll do this in alphabetical order by their Christian name and allow them to introduce themselves and show the slide accordingly. So I'd like to start with Alf from the School of Engineering.
Thank you, John, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually a senior lecturer in chemical engineering and a colleague of John as well in the Center for Energy Transition. It's particularly focused on hydrogen technologies in my research, fuel cells, again, looking into materials used for hydrogen transport. But as you can probably see from the slides that you can see in your screens, as taken from one conference I attended recently, it's really a very complex problem. It's really a global problem that we have here, and a challenge actually about the energy transition. So even if we are working in engineering, we need to take into account all the disciplines, and that's why this panel is so interesting, because we actually have colleagues that are working on different parts of the trilemma, or even the quadrilemma, if you take into account the social aspects as well, which Piotr will actually talk about later. So, so apart from the technical work in the Center for Energy Transition on hydrogen, I'm also part of the Just Transition Lab at the university, when we look into the social impacts of everything we do, from engineering to environment. And I'm a director at the board of the Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group, which is an association of almost 300 members here in the northeast of Scotland, working with companies, councils, schools, etc. And I mention this because, here in Aberdeen, apart from the research and the teaching, we do a lot of work with companies. We need to involve all the stakeholders and get them all engaged in providing the solution. So I think this is probably a fact that defines us as a region as well, the drive to bring everyone in. My kind of day job as well involves coordinating two MSc programs. One is the commissioning of oil and gas platforms, and the other one is the MSc on energy transition systems and technologies, which is a multidisciplinary program. Both are multidisciplinary programs. Again, we have actually people from different schools teaching us, as for example, Piotr. And apart from the value of being multidisciplinary, the fact that we, again, involve visits to companies, and we bring people from outside to talk about experts in the matter, and colleagues from other schools as well. I think it gives a really good flavor of what we're trying to achieve and how to achieve it. So yeah, I think that's enough for me for the time being, John. I'm gonna remain silent for at least a few minutes, and I hope that we can enjoy a great conversation later on in the Q&A.
Thanks, Alf. Your modesty maybe stops you from saying this, but also you're a leading expert on hydrogen economy and the research that you do there. So for those online wishing to ask questions, if you've got specific questions to Alf on hydrogen, as well as sort of more general ones facing chemical engineering or the wider sphere of the energy transition, feel free to deposit those in the Q&A box, and we can pick them up as we go along. Okay, I'm going to turn to our second panelist here, and Kate. Kate is in the School of Biological Sciences and a fellow for the Interdisciplinary Centre of Energy Transition. Kate.
Thanks very much, John. Hi there. Yes, I'm a fellow in the School of Biological Sciences, but also cross over into the School of Geosciences as well. So I'm kind of very much interdisciplinary in that sense. And I have a background in marine energy, based all of my work and research and teaching on in the marine environment. And my main focuses are around the blue economy, particularly oil and gas and decommissioning, renewables and shipping and spatial planning. So I kind of work from the surface of the water all the way down through the water column to the seabed. And I'm interested in around ecological aspects of structures in the marine environment. and particularly impacts that they can have on biodiversity. But I'm also interested globally, sort of from a blue economy perspective around shipping and potential for shipping emissions and impacts around decommissioning, and also shipping through the Arctic as well. And I work quite closely with a number of working groups. I'm part of the UK government's Productive Seas Evidence Group, and also the Society for Underwater Technologies Decommissioning and Wreck Removal Committee. So I have the opportunity to work with a lot of stakeholders and help to try and shape some of the research that we do here with industry and policymakers, so that we can actually develop tools and research that can be impactful. My teaching interests are around spatial analysis and GIS, and I teach on the Marine EIA module for the decommissioning MSc, but also have interest in developing new teaching around use of visualization and the blue economy, and also stakeholder engagement. Thanks, John.
Kate, could you just maybe add something about your work at the National Decommissioning Centre, this state-of-art facility that we've got out at Newborough? I know that you use that a lot, and perhaps the audience would appreciate just knowing a little bit more about the site and the facility we've got.
Of course, John. Sorry, I should have mentioned that before. Yeah, so the National Decommissioning Centre is a sort of joint venture with the Net Zero Technology Centre and the university here. And we are working on a project it's called Data for Net Zero. So we have a number of different works packages, of which ALF is one of the leaders. So we're looking at data and visualization for decommissioning, also looking at repurposing and reusing decommissioned oil and gas platforms, and also around decarbonising decommissioning. And at the centre, we have a state-of-the-art marine simulator and various other software that we can simulate and replicate real-world environments and be able to test them. So primarily around the engineering aspects of how we can simulate different decommissioning or commissioning of renewables, for example. But we're also starting to look at it from an ecological perspective as well, and how we can actually incorporate ecology and environmental aspects within this 3D simulator environment.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really, really helpful. Moving on, Joe is next in alphabetical order. Joe, could you introduce yourself and your background and interests?
Yeah, thanks, John. So yeah, I'm Joe Armstrong. I'm another one of the interdisciplinary fellows. I'm in the Centre for Energy Transition. I'm mainly, well, mainly situated in the School of Geosciences, but with affiliation with the School of Biological Sciences, as well as social sciences as well. And I'm also the director of the MSc in Sustainable Energy Geoscience, which was run for the first time this year, which builds on our history of energy geoscience teaching in the school here, and but has a focus towards the future of geoscience in the energy industry. So we look at a particular focus of mine, which is critical mineral deposits, so the minerals that we'll need for the energy transition, as well as looking at geothermal energy, wind power, and also carbon capture and storage, which may well be a crucial technology going into the transition, and something that a lot of people in Aberdeen are focused on at the moment. My research, as I've said, primarily focuses on the security of supply of mineral resources, particularly those that are called critical minerals. So these are minerals that are found in the subsurface that are necessary for us to build all the new technologies and things like grid infrastructure and solar panels and wind turbines for our shift in the energy transition. I particularly focus on how these minerals got in the ground and how we can find them, particularly looking at remote sensing techniques to better understand how we can accurately find deposits of these minerals under varying levels of cover, so undercover mineralization. But it's part of my fellowship. I'm particularly interested in how we ensure that any mineral extraction that goes on for the energy transition, which is it's going to be extensive based on all the figures that have been produced so far. We're going to need an awful lot of minerals like copper and nickel and lithium and graphite and the like, and we want to make sure that we're not just exchanging one environmental issue for another. So my work particularly focuses on what are the potential impacts of extracting these minerals and how do we avoid them or overcome them and make sure that we're doing things in a sensible and kind of measured way. I think that's pretty much something.
Joe, that's really helpful. Just one point of clarification maybe for the wider audience. What sort of balance is there between your work both in research and training towards facing the UK as opposed to, say, global critical mineral issues? Where do you see your role and the percentage time or balance between those for you?
So currently I have a couple of projects ongoing that have an initial focus on the UK and the northeast of Scotland, understanding if we have any available resources in the ground that would mean that we could source things locally, potentially having a lower carbon cost than shipping things from further afield, and also again part of the security of supply of mineral resources, and it would allow, whether that be the UK or Europe or nations nearby, to have a supply of these resources that was nearby and dependable. But the sourcing of minerals is a global issue, and the carbon impact of these things or the environmental impact of these things is a global issue, and you can't just ignore the fact that we need a lot of these materials, and if you don't extract it here, where do you extract it? And you have to make sure that the governance of these things globally is done right. You don't buying a low carbon piece of low carbon technology, an electric car, for example, here should not have a seriously detrimental impact to another part of the world, and just because we don't see it, it's not happening. Kind of.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Joe. And presumably you do see a role, do you, for reopening old mines or for critical minerals or metals potentially happening in the UK?
It's quite possible. There's recent reports from the British Geological Survey have shown that there's a lot of potential around parts of the UK where previously these minerals were not economically interesting enough, or we didn't have the ability to extract them. But now that's a different story. Now that we have new technology that requires different materials, so it's definitely a possibility and something that I'm actively following up. We might open up old mines or find new resources.
Thanks, Joe. Tremendous. Last but definitely not least, we've got Peter with us. Peter, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself, your background and research interests and teaching and training expertise.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us and watching us. I'm Dr. Piotr Niewiadomski, and I'm a senior lecturer in human geography based in the Department of Geography and Environment in the School of Geosciences. That, of course, makes me a social scientist, which shows that social sciences also contribute to this very important interdisciplinary theme, which energy transition is. And my main role at the university is to lead the cutting-edge master's program called Sustainability Transitions. The program aims to train the next generation of sustainability leaders, so people who have the ambition to deliver on the sustainable development goals in terms of the required and the desired energy transition, but also everything that revolves around it. Whereas one of my main roles outside the university, I'm an associate editor of Tourism Geographies, one of the international leading tourism-related journals, which very strongly focuses on researching and promoting sustainability in tourism. This is also what my research focuses on. I'm interested in sustainability transitions, broadly speaking. I think on this occasion, it is important to explain the difference between energy transition and sustainability transitions. The required shift to renewable energy, so the desired energy transition, is the very core of wider sustainability transitions. Sustainability transitions wouldn't happen without an effective energy transition. But of course, to transition to renewable sources of energy is not enough. Many more changes have to happen at the political, social, cultural, institutional level that requires adequate changes in governance structures, legislation, markets, cultural attitudes, consumer patterns, and many, many things like this. And my research is motivated by a desire to see how sustainability transitions, including transitions to renewable sources of energy, unfold in the global tourism industry. I'm interested in tourism development, and I look at how tourism is becoming or is not becoming sustainable. Sadly, there's still a long way to go in this respect. But of course, it is important that in our research, we do not focus only on some of the key strategic sectors like energy, transport, and food. We also look at other sectors. Tourism is one of the major consumers of energy and water, and one of the major producers of solid waste. So if we wish to transition to sustainability, if we wish to shift to more sustainable forms of production and consumption, we must not forget about other sectors, and that includes tourism, which, for instance, before COVID-19 contributed 10% to the global GDP. So that's hopefully a clear summary of what I do and what my research interests are.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Very helpful, Peter. And I think a very hot topic, of course, when you look at the news currently about Venice and the tourist tax that they've imposed, protests going on in places like the Canary Islands and also in the Balearics and in Mallorca and so on. So, you know, key issues about how we have a sustainable future and the energy use that comes with it and the forms of energy to sustain a tourist community at the right level in the right place. So, you know, really, really important, I think. Without any further ado, we've got loads of questions that have been coming in. There's a theme developing around marine industries impacting the energy transition. So I'm going to turn to Kate and try and summarize a couple of questions that have come in. One is, what are the main environmental challenges of the current energy transition? And while you're thinking about that one, Kate, I'm also going to deposit the following one, which is, and follows on from it, how can they, that is marine industries, help contribute to the transition?
Thanks, John. I think Joe touched on it earlier in his point that there is no free energy. Every single energy resource that we produce has some form of cost, whether it be economic, social, or environmental. And I think for myself, just considering the environmental challenges, the list is quite extensive. But I think the main aspects are around how we can more effectively safeguard biodiversity, and whether that's through more robust policies and decision making around EIA, that's impact assessments, but also around how we consider things cumulatively. It's always been a bit of an issue when we're looking at different types of industries in isolation under different regulations, being regulated by different regulators, and some industries not contributing at all to the impact assessment sort of assessment or producing data. So I think it's definitely around a more robust policy for EIA and data collection and surveys in the marine environment, but also how we can create networks. How can the industries better work together? How can they actually speak to each other, the different sectors, so that we can actually get data that's comparable and robust enough to actually decide upon particular impacts. And then secondly, I'm sure others will probably cover it in more detail, it's around a need for a circular approach to the energy transition in terms of reducing our reliance on primary materials. So from a perspective of your second point to that question, John, around how industries can actually contribute, I think, as I've mentioned before, it's around how they can actually work together, how we can use materials that are being recycled in terms of reuse of, for example, offshore platforms, for example, and also how we can work with industries to, sorry, to go back a wee step. I think the main focus for the energy transition is obviously around reduction of CO2 emissions and net zero targets. But we also have to consider a number of other impacts on industries, not just around them trying to meet their net zero targets, but for example, how we can actually work with fisheries and stop them being displaced because of the placement of offshore wind, for example. So it's like all the energy industries and all the marine industries have a part to play together, and not to be treated in isolation, I think is one of the main challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, and maybe to elaborate on that for the wider audience, that regulation of different aspects of the energy transition sits with different bodies, and so you can get a sort of universe of different technologies, be that wind, be it fisheries, be it environmental protection, oil and gas, carbon storage, that and others that are managed by different bodies. It strikes me that the UK is lacking a sort of holistic, overarching, if you like, UK net zero PLC regulator. And so at the moment there's competition, conflict, and the offshore marine real estate is very busy. Is that your reading of it, Kate? And would you agree that having some sort of overarching umbrella regulator would be helpful?
I mean, it would definitely be one step in the right direction, or just in terms of being able to have data that we can readily share. It's always a challenge as researchers trying to get access to industry data or governmental data. So I think as well, this kind of the idea that we should be collecting data more cumulatively is definitely like how we actually assess impacts cumulatively, but how we can actually gather data and do it in a way that can actually be processed together. We have a number of years of lessons learned from the oil and gas industry in terms of how we've collected data, especially environmental data. And it would be quite nice if we could move forward in the future with this through this energy transition and actually be able to have a database of data that's and knowledge that we can use.
I think we're very fortunate at Aberdeen and in the UK in general, are we not? That a lot of data that has been collected historically in the pursuit of hydrocarbons over the last 50 or 60 years is actually placed on the public record. And so be it seismic data, well log data, core data, environmental data, as you've referred to, is accessible to us in the UK to make informed decisions, undertake research and use it for training in the way that you all do in your programs, that is not as obvious or clear, and sometimes is even considered as state secrets by countries out with the UK. Not all data is as accessible. Again, would you can agree that we in Aberdeen are in a fortunate position having those sort of resources, not necessarily at our fingertips, but certainly being able to draw upon them for our research and training purposes?
Absolutely. And in terms of the environmental data for the oil and gas industry, I've been lucky enough to work with that for a number of years, and creating different resources that industry and researchers can have access to, so that we can actually make the data more accessible.
And place it in things like the simulator that you mentioned at the NDC, National Decommissioning Centre, because that's a fully immersive sort of 3D visionary tool with tremendous opportunities, I think, to utilize those data in the best way.
Yeah, and we have projects starting this year that will be looking at how we can create realistically fouled artificial reef structures, oil and gas platforms, for example, so that we can actually make the whole immersive experience more realistic.
Great, thanks very much, Kate. I'm mindful that we've got other questions coming in, and another one, anonymous participant, but the question is, and maybe this is directed towards Joe, how do we balance the need for materials like minerals and metals, petroleum, oil and gas, marine resources for society to continue to function, but also the need to protect the planet? How do you go about that in terms of getting the trade-offs, the balance, and the protection for the planet?
It's a it's a tough balance to strike, right? It's so how do we balance the need for materials like those metals, petroleum? I suppose part of that, I mean, Kate touched upon it, that in part we need to try and move towards, as close as possible, a circular economy, in that we want to make sure that anything that we're taking out of the ground, it's not being either wasted or it's not being turned into a sort of form of material that is unrecyclable, as far as possible. When that comes down to, say, petroleum that you're burning, well, that's a bit more of a challenge. But if you're taking petroleum out and turning it into recyclable plastics, or making sure you recycle hard plastics, that's potentially quite feasible. From minerals and metals, again, most, especially your kind of base metals, your coppers and leads and zincs and things, are highly recyclable if they're used in the right way and they're pulled back. I think it's as close as you're going to get to balancing the needs and making sure that we're not damaging the planet more than or you're damaging the planet as little as possible. One of the big sort of questions around all this is when individual countries talk about net zero, their drive to net zero, this is sort of thinking about obviously the carbon cost of a lot of these industries. We need to be careful not to just farm out our carbon production or our carbon use to other countries. Just because we don't, so for example, steel production, if we the production of steel is usually quite carbon intensive, it releases a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. But just because we no longer, or in many instances, or we're talking about not producing as much steel in this country, it's still being made, and if we are still utilizing that steel produced in another country, we're still encouraging the release of a lot of CO2. So I think it takes you have to take a global view on a lot of this stuff. You can't just say, well, this country, or say we're talking about the UK. The UK is carbon neutral. Like, Is it? Are we actually are we moving away from carbon intensive materials that we need? Are our actions less carbon intensive, for example? Or are we just?
I think that's really helpful, Joe, because yeah, I've often wrestled with this thought that, and it's in the news, very prominent at the moment, that somewhere like Grangemouth in Scotland is major refinery. Scotland, we could close it down, as in Wales, as I think you're alluding to, close down steel in Port Talbot, but at the cost clearly of jobs, a strategic asset, security of supply, and potentially what we're doing is offshoring the carbon, and we still need steel or petroleum products. There's a demand for them, and we would have a higher carbon footprint to bring them in, rather than try to decarbonize our industry, indigenous industry in the UK, and making sure then the challenge that of capturing the emissions, transporting them, and storing them safely in the ground might actually jobs and GDP, give us energy security, and have a lower carbon footprint than the imports. So I think you really touch upon a crucial issue, and one that actually I would have expected to be more prominent in political circles, particularly a lead up to a general election. But we shall see if energy policy does land on in that area.
Yeah, I totally agree. This, I mean, it's the same argument or similar argument can be made for whether you have extraction of hydrocarbons. If you have, as we do, say, a lot of gas-fired power stations running in your country, do you use natively available hydrocarbons, or do you import them from abroad? And there are carbon implications for importing them, but then that's a pretty it's a large argument. But the same can be said for say environmental protections associated with mineral extraction abroad. Many people, or some people in the UK would not like to see big mines opening in the UK. They don't want to see beautiful spaces affected. And that's a completely fair point of view. However, if we are extracting it, we have the ability to legislate and protect the environment and ensure that we are not damaging it more than is necessary. Whereas if we import that material, one of the pictures I put up on my slide had an image of a nickel laterite deposit in Indonesia, and can be incredibly damaging to extract nickel from that environment. And depending on how well legislated and protected it is, we utilize that nickel. We use it in a lot of things, but if it's not well governed, then you can do a lot of harm. So.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That's helpful. Mindful again of questions coming in. I want to turn to Peter, if I may, now, because there's one that's come in and say, how can we balance the different needs of developing countries when it comes to the global net zero policy? How do we get this right for different countries on different continents, Peter?
Thank you, John. This is an extremely important question, yes, which links to the issue of justice, of course. The global north has been burning fossil fuels for what, 250 years. Because of this, the global north has achieved a certain level of economic development, and it is of utmost importance not to try to tell other countries not to do this, because they also need to balance their need to develop economically, which may have some environmental impacts. So do we focus on protecting the environment, thus preventing other countries from developing, or do we support their need to develop economically, just like we have done it over the last 200 and 250 years? Of course, there are many questions here. First of all, is the Global North the best possible leader here? Should we do this? If we try to do this as the Global North to help other countries transition to sustainability and renewable energy, to what extent will it imitate the structural adjustment programs that were imposed on developing countries in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, which eventually did not help. So it is very important to do this in a just, ethical, and moral manner. And the latest World Energy Council report is talking about evolving with resilience and justice, which definitely closely relates to the energy trilemma question. Yes, resilience in environmental terms, in terms of security, but also justice, so affordability. The report also talks about humanizing energy, which is a very important question. Yes, humanizing energy means giving voices to those who otherwise might be deprived of having any sort of say in the whole debate. That, of course, may include developing countries. That, of course, may include local communities, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So justice is an important issue here. It's a very important aspect at every geographical scale. I wish I had a more concrete answer to your question, John, but we know we don't have it.
Let me give you a specific, for instance, because today South Africans are going to the polls. South Africa, in terms of its energy needs, and here is a dilemma for them, that is largely based on coal, the dirtiest fuel, but it employs lots of people. And now they're finding that they're getting blackouts. This is imposing, of course, fuel poverty, but there's also perhaps a pressure, intrinsic, maybe extrinsic pressure on them to wean themselves off coal, but there is no other substitute within the country at this current time. How do we manage that process in a fair and just way for a country like South Africa that is where it is, without the Northern Hemisphere, if you like, imposing something through saying you must decarbonize that would adversely impact the population and indeed the economic revenues and so on generated by that country? How do you square that circle?
That's a very important question, of course, and thank you for this. And broadly speaking, I wish I had an answer, but I can, of course, only speculate. I very often say to my students that the reason why sustainability transitions unfold so slowly is that we do not have viable alternatives yet. Of course, we have a lot of technology which is disseminated. We try to do this, but sustainability costs money. Not every country, not every community, not every sector can afford it. Another thing is that to what extent the Global North is prepared to share it. One of the reasons why fossil fuel industries are still dominant in the energy system is that fossil fuels are more profitable to many incumbent firms than switching to renewables. We would have to find a way to make renewables at least as profitable as fossil fuels to be able to provide an alternative. Of course, there are other pathways, and I believe Bangladesh is about to open their first nuclear plant soon. Yes, that's a very contested and emotive topic. Yes, to what extent we should count nuclear energy as renewable, as clean. Of course, I'm not trying to say I have an answer to that question, but there are alternative pathways. Many countries are looking for alternatives. to try to free themselves from this system where the economic conditions and the dominance of fossil fuel industries leaves them no choice very often, which hopefully provides at least a partial answer to your question and to the example of South Africa.
I think it does, Peter, very nicely, because what I take from this is that different countries and continents, different things apply, just as they do in the UK, that geothermal might work in one area, but actually it would be hydroelectricity in another, or indeed onshore, offshore wind. So it's horses for courses, depending on where you are, and if you like, the resources you've got available to you, natural resources within that country or continent. Alf, I'm going to turn to you next, because there are a couple of questions that have come in that I'm going to try and link. One is, what is the role do you see, given your expertise in hydrogen, for that as a vector within the energy transition? And the second part of this, which I think is linked, is, Alf, do you find it a challenge to work with the oil and gas companies in Aberdeen? And are they keen to transition to more sustainable energies, including hydrogen, amongst other things? Could you try and answer both of those two aspects?
Yeah, I'll try to be politically correct here. Thanks. Yeah, actually, very interesting questions. Well, hydrogen is first of all, there's no silver bullet on the energy transition. So we're gonna need eventually all the technologies we can get on the way, because we are really getting to this tipping point and no return. So I would say that the way I see the energy transition, and I think the way people see it in general, is like a combination of technologies and a combination of energy sources, which is eventually echoing what you were talking about, the use of different technologies wherever you're in the world, right? And some may be more suitable in some occasions and some others in different opportunities. So I think hydrogen is going to be definitely part of this scenario when we have a combination of different technologies and energy vectors. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about hydrogen, because to make it kind of economically viable, you need large scale, and this is in part because of the efficiencies of some of the processes that you require are still not so high as we would like to. And this is again part of the game. I mean, if you don't invest time, money, and research on these projects, then you never get to that point. One of the reasons why we're trying to push that kind of hydrogen research here in Aberdeen and elsewhere in the world. But you will actually see the fact that most of the nations have already a hydrogen plan and a strategy ahead, and this is because it's going to be absolutely relevant for us in the future. So yeah, the answer to the question is, I think hydrogen is going to be like the sauce that puts a lot of things together, because it's a way to move energy and also material or mass to different parts of the energy transition. It doesn't have a carbon atom, so you can get the energy out of the molecule without producing CO2.
Unless it comes from a gas field, because obviously if you take methane, you get carbon and hydrogen. We need carbon storage with that. So are you thinking primarily of electrolysis of fresh water? So onshore electrification, effectively, of freshwater resources. So green hydrogen, in other words.
Yeah. We could talk about the different colors of hydrogen, the rainbow of hydrogen. So what you described is what we call green hydrogen, because it comes primarily from renewable sources, using electricity from green sources like solar or wind. You can do it onshore, you can do it offshore as well. Here in Aberdeen, we work actually very closely with some of the companies you mentioned in the second question.
I'm keen that you address that bit about oil and gas and whether they're pivoting, and whether you're seeing, Alf, synergies with hydrogen in particular, but maybe other renewable technologies. Is there that move?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that we don't find it difficult, but quite the opposite, actually. We have a lot of companies involved in projects within the university, obviously for their own interest, but also because they believe in the energy transition. A lot of these companies have their own dedicated energy transition departments, And there is I think John, you mentioned earlier, the North Sea is starting to get really packed with a lot of projects going subsea. But the truth is there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, you just have to put together, for example, electrification, and you get green electrons coming from the wind farms, connect them to, for example, an electrolyzer, and you get hydrogen using the water. So that would be green hydrogen. Now, the question you mentioned about hydrogen being produced from natural gas, which is where 90% of the hydrogen is currently coming from, could be evaded by capturing the CO2. So again, you could have a combination of hydrogen production plus carbon capture and storage. Then we're painting our molecule, and it's not green anymore. It's now blue, so it's blue hydrogen. And this is one of the kind of flagstone projects we have here in Aberdeen, down in Peterhead, it's called the Acorn project, when we eventually are capturing the CO2, producing hydrogen at the same time, and the hydrogen being piped to Aberdeen and then the south. But again, you need to capture the CO2, and obviously you're an expert in that. You know that there are still these technical challenges and opportunities. And then you need to transport the hydrogen through the pipelines. And then we have these big projects about how good we can transport the hydrogen through the current pipelines, and how we bring this to our houses and the sectors. There's a whole debate around hydrogen, but it's even that is connected to other technologies. So it definitely needs a lot of multidisciplinary work. And
so you clearly see a role for it, and I think it's BP, is it not, that have the hydrogen hub here in the city. And so clearly at least one oil and gas company, major company, is looking to facilitate hydrogen as a vector for the energy transition.
Yeah, BP is the preferred partner of the hydrogen Aberdeen Hydrogen Hub, together with the Aberdeen City Council, and they are providing a series of reports and studies on how connecting the different hydrogen production and usage here in the region and beyond.
And maybe to just develop that a little bit, I'll add a few comments, because companies like Total Energies and Equinor, just to name two, I could name others, they have joint venture partnerships in wind, and in Equinor's case, they're looking at hydrogen storage and carbon storage offshore, as are BP at the Endurance site, Spirit Energy at Morecambe Bay, and Eni in Liverpool Bay. So there's to answer the question that came in about oil and gas companies, they're certainly exploring these areas. And I'll develop this a little bit more, because we had a question from Tulio Bastos, who said that, in his opinion, this is one of our attendees, our participants, oil mustn't be eliminated. These are his words, but work to 100%. To try and get 100% low carbon and make it green, but he's also worried about the costs associated with this, and do we, as collectively or individuals, agree that there are economic and social costs? I think we've touched on the social costs, and you could close things down, decarbonize, but maybe at costs to jobs and GDP. But one of the interesting things, I think, is the economics. We've touched upon it a couple of times about oil and gas brings in greater revenues, more marginal for wind and other renewable technologies. And carbon storage itself, what we should remember is it doesn't actually produce energy, but is more akin to waste disposal. But if we collect, so capture, transport, and safely store the carbon dioxide in the ground, we potentially reduce the emissions on our industrial clusters and other activities, including, of course, oil and gas, to decarbonize them and take them to net zero. The challenge being the economic business case, and our business school in particular, and the energy law and economics groups look at this particular aspect in detail. Really, the emitter is expected there to pay, and at the moment in the UK, It's actually UK government subsidies that are making the Track 1 and Track 2 carbon stores still viable. But Spirit Energy at Morecambe, in particular, but also companies like Harbour Energy with their Viking CCS project, are looking to get emitters embedded within the whole project so that there is a commercial and business case. But these are some of the significant challenges that we are currently wrestling with, and the UK and other countries are wrestling with as we try to get climate compatibility. Given the very difficult starting point on this journey to net zero, that, as I said right at the beginning, 75% of the UK's total energy needs are still from oil and gas. We have a huge challenge ahead, and the starting point is very, very difficult. So we have to work out a way to decarbonize. But the Committee for Climate Change and others would say that by 2050, oil and gas still has a role, but it needs to be decarbonized by then. So those are some of the challenges to Tulio Bastos in answer to your question. I am very conscious that we've only got 5 minutes left, and there are a number of questions still to be addressed. One of the key questions that's come in is, what kind of role do the panelists expect nuclear energy to play within the transition? And I'm going to open it up to our 4 panelists to see if any of them would wish to pick this one up. Nuclear energy, does it have a role to play in the energy mix and the transition? Kate.
Thanks, John. I'll pick that one up first. Not a particular expert around nuclear energy, but just picking up on points that you made, John and Alf, around the new technologies, in that we don't have a technology yet that can outcompete to scale the oil and gas. So I think we have to, assume that all technologies have their part to play in the energy transition, including nuclear. But I think the main point I just want to make is that we obviously now have 60+ years evidence that says burning fossil fuels contributes to global warming and carbon emissions and other atmospheric emissions. We don't have the same evidence to understand what potential impacts may arise from other technologies, whether that be nuclear or any of the renewable energies. So we have to kind of be careful how we tread in terms of assuming that there is no or little to no impact, excluding the less carbon emissions. And I think there's Professor Beth Scott's group here at the University of Aberdeen had been doing work on the impact of removing wind from the system. And I think that's an important one to note, that once we have the amount of wind farms we are to install in the North Sea, how is that going to impact on the ecosystem, the oceanography, the stratification? So there's potentially on
birds, fish, currents, the wake of the wind. Those unintended consequences and feedbacks, really important.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So I think it's just to be mindful of the fact that there will be consequences no matter what we do. And Joe obviously mentioned it in terms of the minerals and how mining is going to have an impact on biodiversity, for example. So it's just being mindful that everything has an impact. It's just which is the worst impact, and how do we kind of mitigate these different impacts?
Yeah, a superb overview there, Kate, about the trade-offs and impacts and dependencies, I think, between each and every one of the technologies that could be deployed and should be considered in the mix and try and find the optimal outcome. We only have seconds left, so maybe to summarize here, in my lifetime I've seen a 3-fold increase in the population of the planet, and the impact and pressures that puts onto biodiversity and energy supplies are enormous. And now we're going through a pattern where we wish to wean ourselves off oil and gas, if you like, the easy energy source that has been since the Industrial Revolution and beyond, sort of coal and other fossil fuels, through the 21st century to now. We are seeking to pivot. Aberdeen University is central in terms of the academic expertise that we have, the research and training that we do. You've been introduced to 4 panelists and myself that are leading this. One of the crucial things about a university like Aberdeen, I think, is that we are a crucible for the discussion. So it's not polarized. Fossil fuel is bad, environmental and climate is good. It's across the whole piece. We are seeking to get the data and evidence to make technically informed decisions, to influence policy and politics, and to get the best outcome for the UK and the globe. So we wish to keep energy supplies going, make them affordable, but ensure that environmental sustainability and climate is not only respected, but really centre stage in the path and journey that we're on. We hope that you've all enjoyed the last hour. Certainly for me, the time has just flown by in listening to my colleagues and trying to collate the questions. I apologise I haven't been able to get to all the questions through the piece, but I hope you've enjoyed it and got a flavour for how exciting the research is and training and opportunities are at Aberdeen University. And we look forward to engaging with you further, and hopefully some of you will apply, be offered places and wish to come and join us on this exciting research journey. So thank you again to my colleagues, panelists. Thank you for everybody for joining, and for Brian and Margaret, who are in the background orchestrating this as well, done a superb job. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you should you wish to continue the dialogue with us individually or collectively. Thank you.